All right. As some people are trickling in from the meeting room, it's really exciting to see you all. Please definitely turn your video on if you don't have it. We love to see your faces. If not, totally okay. And put your name and where you're logging in from in the
3 or so minutes as people trickle in.
And if you're watching on YouTube as well, you can go ahead and put your name and location in the YouTube chat. And so let me just introduce myself first. My name is Anna. I am coming from Louisville, Kentucky. And I'll be moderating the event with Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lar. You'll hear a little bit more about me in a minute, and I'm calling from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
All right, we have Jeffrey from Montreal. Hello, Jeffrey. We have Jerry from Sacramento. Jessica is in Oakland. Our producer, Dave Lashansky from Del Mar, California. I really like saying Dave's last name. It just rolls off the tongue. Lashansky. And we will get started in probably about 2 minutes. So, go ahead, grab a drink of water, a snack. We have Jen from Salem, Massachusetts. Hey, Jen. I can see the list of participants. And I don't think he's introduced himself, but his name is Michael Jackson. Very cool.
Yeah, Michael's a friend of mine. He's also calling in from Philadelphia.
Oh, cool. We have Cody and Rudy from Boston. Hello. And Isabel is also in Boston as well. Really cool to see some of your faces, you guys. Really cool. All right, let's kick it off. Over to you, Laura.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. I'm just going to share my screen. Is that showing up okay?
Great.
All right, wonderful. So hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Lar Hesse-Fisher. I'm the founder and director of Civic Series, and Civic Series is a volunteer-led nonprofit organization that's really here to help you understand and think for yourself and have meaningful conversations about the most important issues of our time. So our events, which are normally in person, but of course during COVID are virtual, help you get oriented to what's going on in different issue areas and allow you to ask questions of experts in a nonpartisan and safe space. So tonight you're probably here because you're kind of curious about the electric grid. So this is an introductory event to go over where our electricity comes from, what we learned from the Texas power grid outage, and how things are changing in this country to deal with affordability, pollution, and climate change. So before we begin, I want to give a big thank you to our largest donors, the Rhyme and Reason Fund of the Boston Foundation and the Harris family, as well as all of you who donated when you registered. I volunteer my time to organize these events because I am so passionate about helping people understand the really complex world that we live in and to feel connected to that. And Civic Series is a 501c3 charity. And if you can spare a donation, your contributions will go very far in letting us to produce content like this. You can find Civic Series on PayPal or Venmo, or you can visit civicseries.org/donate. And if you wouldn't mind, if you're able to throw that link in the chat. And if you've already donated or choose to donate, thank you so much for your contribution. Okay, so here is how tonight is going to go. For the first 20 or 30 minutes, I'll have a fireside chat with our guest expert, Harvey Michaels, and we'll give an overview of tonight's topic. And then we'll open it up for your questions for about 30 to 40 minutes at the top of the hour. And then we'll jump into breakout groups, and we'll do that for about 10 minutes. And we have some prompts for you to discuss in those breakout groups. And then we'll come back for about 20 minutes to answer more questions before we wrap up at about 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. So our events are pretty interactive normally, and we're going to replicate that here. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who's going to explain how this is all going to work for those who are new to Civic Series.
Great. It's been really cool being able to moderate these events over the pandemic. Originally, Civic Series did live events where you'd be able to really interact with each other, just person to person. But Zoom gives us the ability to facilitate and get us close to those types of interactions. And when you turn your video on, it really helps to give that feel of that person to person interaction. And when you have a question, just put it into the Zoom chat where everyone can see, and then I'll be able to see it. Even though everyone's muted, once we get to the Q&A time, I will prompt whoever's question is up next to ask it, and you'll be able to ask Harvey your question live. So the Q&A time is right after the fireside chat, and there'll be plenty of time to ask your questions. But as the event is going on, put your questions in the chat. And like Laura said, after the Q&A time, there will be some breakout rooms, and you'll get an even greater chance to interact with each other, talk with each other about what you've been hearing and what you're still thinking about. And last but not least, if you during the breakout session, the conversation just comes to a natural close, you can always come back to the main lobby area. So really excited to get this going.
Great, thanks, Anna. And also, if you want to, if it works better for you to text our mailbox, then Anna has access to that too. So the number is up on the screen here. And Anna, if you wouldn't mind putting that number in the chat too, so you can text us your question. I want to emphasize that there's no such thing as a dumb question at Civic Series. In fact, the point of Civic Series is to ask the questions that you feel are too dumb to ask anywhere else. And I will volunteer to be the dumbest person in the room and ask all of the dumb questions for you if you so choose. So texting is a good way to be anonymous if you want to do that. Okay, so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest expert today. Harvey Michaels teaches MIT business, technology, and policy students about energy and climate innovation. And he is the principal investigator of the Cities and Climate Change program at the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative. And before teaching at MIT, he went to MIT, but after that, he led 2 energy efficiency companies and now serves on several clean energy boards and advisory committees. So Harvey, we are so pleased to have you here today. Is there anything you want to add before we jump in?
Well, thank you, Laura. I've been pleased to work with you in a few different roles over the last half dozen years or so, and I really appreciate connecting, and thank you for inviting me to this.
Great, wonderful. All right, so one of the prompts that I gave folks who registered is for them to check out the podcast that you did for MIT's Climate Podcast. And I hope that everybody on the call had a chance to listen to it, but some of them might not have, and some of them might have done it a month ago and have forgotten about it for now. So, so what are the 1 to 2, well, what I'll say first is we covered how the electric grid works in that, right? Like the super basics, and it gave a hint at how some things are changing. But what do you think are the 1 to 2 takeaways that you want everyone to remember from that episode?
Okay, a quick summary and putting it into current events. We talked about the electric grid from the very beginning, and Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb and then inventing the electric utility in 1880 in order to power his light bulbs. And we went through the progression. I often, when I talk about that now, go even a little bit earlier to Michael Faraday in 1830, who made the basic idea for a generator, which is called a dynamo. Which is basically, if you can turn something inside a wire with a magnet, you make electricity flow through the wires. And that's essentially the way all of our electricity works. That's the way the power plants that run on coal or natural gas work. That's the way wind power works and hydropower works. And pretty much everything works with the exception of solar energy, which doesn't work that way. It works with sun shining on a crystal and making electricity. So that's the setting that we started going back and bringing it forward. And the intriguing thing that's happening lately is we're having some tremendous change, which is driven by technology, and it's also driven by climate. And we just are concluding Earth Week. And so it's a really good time to bring that into it. It's also very relevant to my path in this field because I got intrigued and involved in this field in the first Earth Day in 1970. So that's how long I've been involved in this to some extent. But the way these things come together is that now we're having a power grid that's transitioning. And as it transitions to being having the electricity we use being generated by solar energy and wind energy increasingly, and needing batteries to balance that out so we have power available all the time, we have a particularly different grid than we used to have, which had major baseload power plants, as they were called, like nuclear plants and coal plants, and then some that we turned on times when the demand was really high, like gas peaking generators. And now we have a system that has solar and wind energy, which is great and it's clean, but it has the big difference compared to the power plants we had before, that the power comes out of those plants when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, not on a fixed schedule. So this requires a different way of thinking about the electric grid. And that's basically the transition we're going through as we change over to a clean energy and carbon-free electric system.
That was a great summary. And if anybody has questions about any of those details, feel free to ask them over to Anna and we can deal with them in the Q&A or check out the podcast episode, which digs into each of those a little bit more, in a little more detail. Okay, so one of the things that we didn't talk about in the episode was what the grid system looks like in the US. Like how many grids are there, which is an important part of the Texas conversation. And then why was it built the way that it's built?
Well, it grew up originally through competition. Thomas Edison made electricity one way, it's called direct current. And then Westinghouse started making electricity a different way, an alternating current. And they battled it out, and actually Westinghouse won. And we have a grid system which is composed of alternating current. And so there's this competition in the way it began. Over the years, the electric system became controlled by states, and they essentially assign a company a monopoly to produce the electricity that we use. So the companies, some of you are in the Boston area, and you have Eversource. New York, you have Con Edison, Commonwealth Edison in Chicago. Lots of companies around the country are private companies, but they are controlled and regulated by the state that they're within. So the most important unit in how many grids we have is that each state really operates somewhat separately. But most states collaborate with the states around them and have essentially pools of electricity so they can be more efficient and share electricity across borders with transmission wires, which are the very high level, high power wires that you see. And that happens, the New England has its own system operator and power pool, and other areas of the country have those as well. So there are kind of fewer grids if you count them from the standpoint of that connection. The interesting thing you raised Texas is a standalone state. It doesn't connect with any of the states around it. It runs its own system, which made it a little bit more vulnerable and had something to do with the problems they had a few months ago.
Wait, can I ask a follow-up question about that? So what you're saying is in each state, they generate their electricity and they have the companies that generate the electricity and they kind of pass around the state. But then through these larger grids, there are relationships between the different states to share electricity. And so they buy it and sell it to each other.
That's
And
right.
those are the primary grids. But Texas doesn't buy and sell electricity to anybody outside of Texas.
Basically, that's right. And not only that, it doesn't have that many wires that connect to the states outside of Texas. So it stands a little bit more freely than is what's typical. As a matter of fact, there are circuitous routes, but you can get electrons, which are what electricity is composed of, through the grid somehow. And there's a way to get an electron from Massachusetts all the way down to Florida and all the way west to Illinois. They all have some connections. But Texas doesn't really have connections outside its borders. So that's a different one. The Western states have an interconnection system as well. So to some extent, you can say there are three grids. There's the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and Texas in terms of the way the United States is organized. But then this breaks down, as I said, for most of us as consumers, our relationship is with our particular electric company. And that electric company is usually either regulated by the state or it's sometimes a public company. And it's your city that runs its electricity. Many cities now run their own electric system for their own city. And so those are sometimes the unit where you buy your electricity.
So I think we're in a minute, we're going to talk about why Texas is its own standalone thing. But why is the East and West Coast standalone grids? Why isn't it all the same? Why isn't the whole country just all connected?
I think there probably will be connections everywhere. And there's just a matter of organization and management. And sort of the management system gets a little bit unwieldy as the number of actors in the system gets larger. So that probably had something to do with a few lines being drawn. And that's always the challenge with electricity because it's a difficult commodity to use. It has to be made at the same time that it's consumed in just about the exact amount being made as the amount being consumed. And as we change the amount we consume during all hours of the day, as the sun goes down, the lights go on, we change our electricity. As it gets hotter or colder, we change our electricity. The power in the wires needs to go up and increase to provide for the power needs that we have at that time. So it becomes a very intriguing engineering problem to put just the amount of electricity into those wires for all the devices that consumers have that are using electricity, pulling electricity out of those wires in pretty much an instantaneous manner. So you have a benefit by doing a lot of connections in that you have laws of large numbers, which help average things out. But you also have some difficulties with organization as you make these systems larger. It's probably the most complicated machine that's ever been built is the power system that we have that provides are just what we take for granted, that when we turn on the switch, the lights will go on.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think when you and I talked a couple of years ago about this, you use like a stream, right? Like imagine there's like this flow of water that we're having going over a cliff like a waterfall. And we want to make sure that everybody who has a cup can put their cup under the waterfall and get enough water, but not have too much because we don't want to waste it, right? And so we have to really understand how many people there are and how big their cups are. But then at the same time, we have all of these different water sources feeding into the stream. We have ones that are really constant, some that just do every once in a while, some that we have to like, if we're running low, we need to like let this dam loose and let more water go through. It's actually kind of amazing that it works at all. Are we like wasting tons of electricity all the time? Or like these utility companies pretty much have it down, like they've figured it out?
Well, it's not perfect, but they do have usually a pretty careful system of being able to dispatch, as they called it, the right number of power plants to be on at any time to provide the power that's needed at that time with a little bit of cushion. So that's why there are certain plants which they call baseload plants, which are just on. And those tend to be the larger plants that take a long time to start up or turn down. And then they have other power plants, which are more on call, that can be turned on and off more quickly. And those are called peaking power plants. So it's largely those. They either have systems where the utility owns all the power plants. So they're making essentially a management decision which plants to turn on to have enough power at any time, or other systems which are market-based, where essentially companies that own power plants have made an offer at what price they're interested in selling their electricity. And then the system operator chooses the plants to turn on, so that basically they tend to turn on the least expensive plants first. And then as the power draw gets larger and larger, let's say it's a really hot summer day, and so all the air conditioning is on, they'll start buying electricity from the power plants where it's the most expensive to provide that electricity, and eventually buy enough power that they'll have enough electricity going in the wires to cover all the air conditioning that people might have on at that time.
So this is a really good foundation for understanding how things are going to change. But let's just put a pin in that for a second, because I wanted to ask you, and I think we could do this a little bit briefly, and if people have questions, we can go into more detail. But can you tell us what exactly happened in Texas? People said a lot of different things. It was wind, no, it was gas, so what exactly happened, and what have different people learned from that experience?
Yeah, so we're still learning exactly what happened in Texas, but there were at least two parts to it. One was that it was an unusually cold period. One of the things that climate change does is it creates extreme weather. So it may be responsible for what happened in Texas. It's hard to know in a particular short-term weather event whether worldwide climate change is the cause. But they went through a very unusual period for about a week of having temperatures that were about 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit colder than they typically have in the middle of a winter. And it doesn't sound like a lot. And to those of us in the Boston area, the fact that the temperature dropped into the teens is not something that sounds particularly cold or unusual or shocking, but it was down there. And as a result, two things happened. One thing that happened is certain power plants were not really weatherized to deal with the freezing, and they had condensation buildup that froze, and valves that were not exposed to the weather and froze. And so they didn't have the amount of power available that they even usually have, because these power plants stopped operating properly because of the cold. But the main thing that happened is the amount of power that people wanted exploded, and that they have a lot of electric heat. People think of Texas as a place about oil and gas, but there's lots of use of electric heat in Texas. And it's fine because it usually doesn't get that cold, but in this period of time it did. So the amount of electricity that people were looking for was unusually high. It was the highest on record in Texas, at the same time that a lot of the power plants froze up and stopped having electricity available because valves froze or other things got in the way of delivering electricity because of the cold. And that resulted in a historic outage. And for that market, they do have a market in Texas. For the people who did have power, they were exposed to a price for their electricity that was 100 times higher than what they were used to. So people got bills where they were expecting to have a $300 bill for the month. They got a $30,000 bill for that month. And that was something that they couldn't pay. And it created the crisis that you've heard about.
So what have we learned from that? I mean, I guess it depends who we is, right? There's people in Texas, but then there's also people who are perhaps utility managers that are looking at Texas. So what lessons can be taken away from what happened?
Well, we're going to have more extreme weather, weather that used to happen every 100 years. Some kind of 100-year thing happens all the time, whether we're talking about, floods or fires or heat or drought, or cold. We're going to experience things. So we need to have resiliency built in to all of our systems to deal with it. We need to expect the unexpected. We need to expect the extreme event and have our equipment and be ready for it. So certainly we're learning that lesson everywhere in things that are happening, and Texas is learning it from the standpoint of this cold. But the other thing we're learning, and this is something that impacts us nationally, is that as we switch from using fossil fuels for heat, like natural gas for our heat and oil for our heat, and we start relying more on using electricity for our heat, which is what is really the trend in terms of what we need to do for climate. We have to have an electric system that's able to deal with all of that need that will happen on an extremely cold time, like what they experience in Texas. And I don't know that any of us are quite ready for that or have figured that out yet. So that's one of the challenges we have.
Yeah, and so that's a great lead in. And just to provide a little bit of background, what you pointed to is something that they call electrification, right? So things that we're currently using fossil fuels for, we electrify them. So most of us heat our homes using natural gas, or in some cases oil, right? We pump that stuff into our homes, and then our furnaces burn it, and we're putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere, or sorry, putting CO2 in the atmosphere as we burn these fossil fuels. So one way to deal with climate change is to, instead of having a furnace that burns oil or burns gas, have it accept electricity from the grid. And then you generate that electricity not using coal or natural gas or oil, but instead using wind or solar or nuclear or hydropower or something else that doesn't emit carbon emissions. So that's the trend there as we move in that direction. So you mentioned that there's going to be more need for electricity as we have extreme events, so extreme heat and extreme cold, and people pump up their ACs or pump up their heaters. But then also as we get more electric furnaces and other kinds of electric vehicles, which is the same trying to solution. So can you just spell out for us a little bit how our electric grid is changing now and in what ways?
Sure. So as we two things are driving the grid to change. One is climate, and the other one is economics. The economics are such that solar energy is the cheapest way to generate electricity on Earth, and the majority of new power that's being generated worldwide, new power plants that are being put in worldwide, are solar and wind energy. So that's a change, and it's driven by a lot of things, but among them, besides clean air and besides climate, is economics, that it is the least expensive source of power that we have. So we're putting more solar and wind into our grid. And then as part of the economics, we're using coal less for producing electricity. And it used to be that we had more electricity that was generated by coal than anything else. So we're making that kind of change. So to get to where we're going to be, we're eventually going to probably have no coal electricity or very little coal electricity, other than coal plants that are in a position to be able to sequester the carbon out of the smokestack in a way that the carbon doesn't go into the atmosphere. We still have a lot of natural gas electricity. Natural gas is less expensive than coal or oil, and it's also puts less carbon in the atmosphere than coal and oil. So we still have a good amount of natural gas, but in time, we'll have less natural gas as well. So we have a system that right now, nationally, puts about 1/3 less carbon in the atmosphere than it did 10 years ago. And in some areas of the country, we're putting less than half the carbon in the atmosphere that we did 10 years ago. And the expectation and the intent is that in the next 15 years, we're going to go to almost an entirely clean energy grid, which means we'll have solar, wind energy, batteries, hydropower, nuclear power, and a few other sources providing the electricity we use. And it requires this balancing act to make sure we have enough power at all times as customers need it.
So I have one last question for you before we head into the Q&A and open it up to folks. So what are some of the equity issues surrounding energy today? You spoke a little bit about the extreme case in Texas where there was a crisis and people were charged $30,000, but that's not usual. That doesn't usually happen. In the US today, I actually know we have some people in Canada, so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that too. But, are there affordability issues with folks and electricity today? And as these changes happen, who's paying for them? And is it possible that we all will be paying for these changes?
Yes. So the reality is, even though a lot of us aren't charged different prices for electricity at different times of the day, at the wholesale market, these prices change so dramatically. And one way or another, it affects us as customers. The most likely case is that we actually will be charged through what's called smart meters, different prices at different times of the day. And what that means is that almost all the time, like 80 to 90% of the time, electricity is going to be cheaper than it is now. And Texas had these prices. So most of the time, other than this cold spell, electricity in Texas was actually pretty cheap, where it cost 20 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour in the Boston area right now. A lot of the electricity in Texas, most of the time, was only 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
And Harvey, why was it that much cheaper? You were talking about smart metering. Can you say a little bit more of what that is?
Well, it's basically measuring the electricity at different moments in time and charging you for the electricity then. So the electricity that you use at certain times of the day when solar energy is plentiful and the amount of electricity that people are looking for may not be that high, maybe the middle of the day while everybody's at work on a summer day, on a sunny day that isn't particularly hot or particularly cold. There's a ton of solar energy and people aren't necessarily looking to use that much. A few hours later, the sun goes down, people come home from work, they start cooking dinner, they turn their lights on. Maybe it's warm enough, they turn their air conditioning on. And now they're drawing the power and the solar energy isn't there at that point. So what'll happen is the price will go up. The price for electricity at 7 p.m., like this time of night on some days in the year, is going to be higher than it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or it will be at 10 o'clock at night. Because there's a lot of draw of electricity and there isn't the supply that there was in the middle of the day. So at those points in time, the electric price is going to be higher. So the equity issue, going back to your equity question, Laura, is that people who have means and ability will be able to get equipment that works well with that. They'll have an electric vehicle that they can charge during the times when it's not expensive. They will have controls on their heating system and air conditioning system and water heater so that they are putting mostly low-cost electricity into their system, into their house, and using mostly low-cost kilowatt hours and not the high-cost kilowatt hours. And lower-income people may not really have the same number of choices. One of the things we're discussing here in Massachusetts is working towards the end of the natural gas pipe system that people use to heat their homes. And if someone tells a wealthy household, you got 10 years to come up with some alternatives for your home. And we got some good opportunities with heat pumps, which are a low cost, high efficient way to do it. They'll be able to do it. But people in lower income circumstances, in city neighborhoods, in renters, may not be able to have the ability to transform their property and their systems the same way that more wealthy households and communities would. So this is an example of the equity challenges that we'll have. You know, the challenges, if you have the resources and the time and the ability, you can find ways around the challenges, but we need something that works for everyone.
We covered a lot of ground over 30 minutes, and I know we've already had questions come in. So thank you so much for that overview, Harvey. And Anna, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. So I'm going to first just kick it off with some of our questions from Eventbrite. And just going off of the smart metering and smart grid topic, how much of the electric grid in the US at least is considered smart?
Okay, so I think smart meters are in place in the majority of the country now, about 2/3 perhaps, but not that many of them yet are being used in a smart way. You may have a meter in your house that's able to record how much electricity you're using at different times of the day, but the electric company may not give you any rates or any options in how to take advantage of that, which is one of the things that we need to fix. So roughly the answer is 50%, but it should be 100%. And sometimes it's administration and regulation that's in the way, not equipment.
Got it. All right, so our next question is going to be from Kieran Humphreys. I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute, Kieran, and you can ask your question.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
And see me now? I wrote it so nicely. So I'm a big fan of air source and ground source heat pumps for heating as an alternative to natural gas furnaces and whatnot. And I know that they're much more efficient than, say, a conventional electric furnace that just works on resistance, whereas a heat pump can actually take the energy from the ground or from the air and put that into your house. So that's much more efficient. And I was thinking that that would be a good way for us to lower the impact on the grid while electrifying everything. So I was wondering if that's becoming more popular in the States. I'm actually in Canada, but I was wondering how that can be incentivized and more popularized, because nobody here thinks of it. Like, I tried to get a heat pump installed in my house last year, and the furnace salesman just laughed at me.
Yeah, well, Kieran, that's something we need to figure out. What we have going for us is heat pump sounds like a new idea or something that we haven't had, but if you have a window air conditioner, that's a heat pump. If you have a refrigerator, that's a heat pump. The idea of having essentially be able to move heat from inside the house outside, which is what an air conditioner does, or outside of the house inside, which is what a heat pump does, is essentially the same thing. And what's happening now is equipment is changing. The manufacturers aren't making as many air conditioners anymore. They're just making heat pumps instead. So the next time you buy an air conditioner, the next time if you have a house with central air conditioning and you change the piece of equipment outside, or if you get tired of lugging the room air conditioners in the windows and you decide to buy what's called a ductless mini split, which is this thing that goes through your wall, it's going to be a heat pump, which means that you can use it for heat as well as air conditioning. The same piece of equipment, it looks the same, it works the same, it costs about the same, but it has essentially a reverse mode where it can be heat as well as air conditioning. And that's becoming routine. The only challenge with it, you're in Canada, and the same challenge here in the Boston area to somewhat, is that heat pumps work way great in milder weather, which is the reason why Texas liked heat pumps. In milder weather, they cost less for heat than natural gas. They're basically the same thing that provides you air conditioning. You don't have to buy any more equipment, and you have your heat provided at low cost as well. It's beautiful. The problem is that when you get to really cold weather, the heat pumps don't work as well anymore. So that's a challenge we're trying to fix, make the technology better so it'll work well in Canada and work well in cold climates in the US. And the technologies are getting better. But the big answer that we're coming to right now, just like we have hybrid cars, which are plug-in hybrid, you get electricity and gasoline that run the car, is essentially we're having hybrid heat and hybrid houses, which have a combination of heat pumps and something for really cold weather, which could be the old gas or oil system, or it could be a wood stove, or it could be something else that supports getting the heat in your house during extremely cold weather.
I was wondering about that transition that you mentioned. Is it because of regulation, or is it just manufacturers are doing this to make most things heat pumps?
Yeah, I mean, basically it doesn't cost them much more to make an air conditioner or heat pump than to just leave it as an air conditioner. And so now that people are learning that it's a good product, it could be one product does two things. It does your air conditioning and your heat. Then manufacturers are tending to go that way. Window air conditioners are probably going to be the last ones to change because it's just not a good place to have your heat coming from in the middle of the winter. Just too much heat loss there. But everything else, and certainly these ductless mini splits are like that, and the kind of things where people have central air conditioning, those are all becoming heat pumps.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Kieran, for your question. And up next we have Carol. Go ahead, Carol. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. And
unmute myself.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I have two questions for you. One would go back to your discussion of the grids. And I know that different companies can buy and sell electricity on the grid, but can they also store that electricity if they have more than anyone needs?
Well, I think the grids are getting, that's interesting. I have an echo. I wonder where that's coming from.
Now.
Is it okay?
No, it was on Carol's phone. No problem.
Okay. Grids are getting clever about making interesting kinds of arrangements with people. So they're basically offering people money if they will store electricity for them in their car batteries or their Tesla Powerwalls or other batteries. And they're essentially offering consumers incentives if they want to do that. And they're also offering consumers incentives for essentially a commitment to turn some power off during peak times. So sometimes if you have a factory with a big machine that shreds automobiles into scrap or something like that, and the utility company will offer them a certain amount of money to agree to not use that equipment during times when we're basically have some congestion of power. We have essentially more demand than we have supply. So there are these clever things going on, and particularly in places where the price of electricity varies by hour. Sometimes you can do this yourself, but if you have a battery in your home, you can buy electricity when it's cheap and put it into your battery and then use it in your home when electricity would have been expensive to buy from the grid. Use the battery instead.
I'm wondering,
Okay,
Harvey. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to just expand a little bit on the storage thing, because storage is also important over time with wind and solar as well. So so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. And then also you talked about batteries. Are there other forms of storage as well?
Yeah, so certainly in the technology revolution that we've had over the last decade, where so many things have supported what we're trying to do with solar and wind energy, as we talked about, becoming so much less expensive, and batteries becoming much less expensive, and other important technologies like LED bulbs. LED bulbs use 1/8 the electricity of an old bulb. So some things are coming along that are helping us. In terms of storage, the fact that batteries are so much less expensive is really important to making all this solar and wind work together well. But yes, there are other forms of storage. There are places where we pump water uphill and then essentially let it flow down to run through a hydro generator when we need it. So that's a way to store, when we have excess electricity, we're pumping the water up and then we let it come down. That's called pumped hydro. We directly store heat. We have ways that we can store heat and then use the heat later when we need it. Your home is actually, to some extent, a storage medium as well. If you make your home a little bit extra warm when the electricity is cheap, you can let it keep you warm as the electricity gets more expensive. So yeah, there are some variety of forms that we can use together to smooth out the peaks and valleys of an intermittent power system.
All right. Go ahead, Carol. You have a quick follow-up question.
Oh, yes, I have a second question. As a residential consumer, I have been approached by companies that call themselves green or clean energy, and they are compelling me to change my source of the energy. And I've been advised to be very cautious about that because of the variable rates. They promote a very low rate to begin with, and then I've heard, I don't know if this is true, and I'd like your thoughts on this, that they can raise the rates later on. And so I've been reluctant to, even though I'm, I want to do the environmentally right thing, I've been reluctant to buy any of those from any of those companies.
Well, you must live in a state, Carol, that has, you can choose your retail electric company. So rather than having just one utility that you buy your power from, you get a choice of who you buy your power from, and they're offering you different prices, and they're offering you claims of having different amounts of clean energy in terms of encouraging you to make your decision. And you're also describing that there's some experience with these companies being in some way unscrupulous, that they'll basically sign you up for their power source, their power supply, and then when you aren't paying attention, raise the rates, and you end up with a bill that's higher than you expected. That's all true. It is true that if they say they're providing green electricity, what they're actually doing does create more green electricity. They're essentially buying the rights to the output of the clean energy sources, the solar or wind power, to be their electric supply. And in buying those rights, they're providing money that encourages more solar and wind power. So that's true. It is creating more green electricity to the extent that you choose a supplier that claims they're providing you with green electricity. But in terms of the pricing, that's a challenge. The Attorney General here in Massachusetts is coming down pretty hard on a lot of the retail providers and forcing them to not do things like you described of pressing the rates forward. And the biggest thing that's happened in our area, and I know some other states, is a community as a whole picks a supplier rather than an individual, like you're describing, that you have these different companies to choose from. And it seems kind of risky and complicated, but instead what happens is the town you live in essentially shops for a retail supplier and makes a choice from the standpoint of its being economic as well as green. And that becomes the default supplier that the town has. And that actually, I think, is a really good system. It's called community choice aggregation. And it's very popular here in Massachusetts and some other states. And it solves a lot of the problems you're talking about, Carol, in that there's a group that's essentially watching out for you to make sure you have a good supplier.
A quick question about that, Harvey, to clarify. Carol was mentioning that it's these green electricity companies that are coming to her. Is that, but they're kind of maybe taking this somewhat predatory approach with it. Is that because is that anything to do with the fact that they're a green company, or is that just them and their business practices, and it really is independent of whether or not they're a green company?
Right. No, that's just a retail choice that's coming, so that that's not the reason. It's not because it's green. Green is a feature that they're selling that is probably a sound choice. But it has been their practice to have a low cost price in order to encourage people to sign up. And it's like a lot of things that you sign up for, you get a low cost price on a magazine, and then after the year is up, it starts charging you more for the magazine or something like that. So it's basically the same trick, right? They bring you in with a low price, and then after they renew you automatically, after a year, they put you on a higher price. So that's the problem, and it gets in the way of our having more green electricity, perhaps. So that's why it needs to be regulated.
Thanks.
All right. One of our questions from the Eventbrite asks about infrastructure. So this question is specifically about what type of infrastructure would we need, at least here in the US, to transition the electric grid to more renewable sources, and how that's integrated into the grid?
Well, the word infrastructure is really big right now because it's connected with the plan that the Biden administration is putting forward. So it means all of the above. But in order to be able to have, let's say, wind power providing more electricity, we're going to be able to need to move that power some longer distances, and that requires transmission lines. So that's often an example of the infrastructure that's described. And then it's also used to just mean the power plants themselves. There's a discussion of having a big wind system that's offshore of New England in the Gulf of Maine. And just that large wind system itself could be a combination of public and private investment. Just the same way the government had something to do with building our roads, they might have something to do with building the power plants that are offshore New England.
All right. So we have another question. Go ahead, Bill. You sent a question to me, and you can go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Michaels. I actually want to follow up on the infrastructure bill that is being proposed. We know that the national grid is fragile and needs improvement. I'm wondering how you feel about what is being proposed for upgrades to the national grid. Do you feel like what they're proposing makes sense? And in your opinion, what is needed in terms of priorities for the national grid to promote power resiliency?
I think we need to, there's the question in infrastructure is what does the government need to invest in versus what does it need to encourage private markets to invest in? And I think that's probably the big question we have in deciding whether this infrastructure bill is the right way to get to where we need to go. And let me just give you an example. We talked about federal money supporting the development of a new large wind power system in the Gulf of Maine. Is that a good idea? It probably is. I mean, when the federal government supported building the Bonneville power projects and the Tennessee Valley Authority, it created this hydropower that was a low-cost source of clean energy that we've had now for 50 years. So their support of a project in the Gulf of Maine for wind is probably a good investment, produce low-cost power, and is probably worthwhile. But that's one approach to it. Another approach to it would be a carbon tax, where we essentially made fossil fuel electricity more expensive and took the money that we got from collections on that to essentially support consumers in buying, improving the energy efficiency of their homes or their businesses, as an example of another approach, of a market-based approach. So is infrastructure investing a good idea? It may be, and it probably is part of it, but infrastructure as well as market approaches probably should be considered.
Thank you.
All right. Great. We do have a question from who texted in, and Laura, I'm going to ask you if you could help me out and ask that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure. So the question was about, all right, so you have all of these power plants putting electricity onto the grid. So what happens when they put too much on the grid or too little? If too much, could that be dangerous, right? Are there going to be, is there a potential for melted wires or fires or anything like that? And then what happens if it's too little? And then the other question was, like, in what increments do utilities manage demand? Is it like seconds, nanoseconds, minutes?
Give me 1 second while I flick the light switch, because it's getting kind of dark back here. And
Yes, sure. I had to do that too as the sun goes down. Speaking of electricity.
So, right, it is getting dark. All right, so the amount of time that they need to balance the system is pretty short. They have devices on it that capture sort of shocks of electricity, where they're able to store it and put it back in a small amount of time, because it really is a second by second thing. But there is equipment that balances that. In terms of what happens if there's too much power, if you notice that at least most of your modern outlets have 3 prongs in them, and one of them is the ground. And it's called the grounding wire because it ultimately gets to the ground. And essentially, that's where the surplus electricity, when there's too much, gets dumped. So rather than it making something blow up or burn up, it goes through that wire to the ground. And that's why it's important for things to be grounded. So does it cost anything to dump the electricity into the ground? Generally not. But when you're talking about things on grid scale, there are some challenges in dumping way large amounts of electricity. So if you're in the, let's say, the Phoenix area, and you got lots and lots of sun, and so you got lots and lots of solar energy, and not that much in terms of people wanting to use electricity at that moment in time, there are cases where utilities are paying people to take electricity off their hands. And so we talk about the opportunities that we have. Laura, do you want me to just throw up, that PowerPoint picture that I was going to show before? Yeah, so as things get really kind of interesting now, where people have solar on their roofs and there's solar on the power systems, and they have heat pumps and advanced meters, which we've talked about, it gets in some ways complicated, but in other ways interesting. There'll be times when the grid's offering us power for free. And those are really great times to charge up our car and to make use of electricity for other things And people are coming up with ideas like using surplus solar electricity to not only charge batteries like we talked about, but potentially to make hydrogen that we can then burn at another time that's carbon free. So that's the opportunity of balancing the system that needs to be balanced from time to time. But also it gets interesting because, as we talked about, there may be times when there just isn't that much power on the grid and we're really short. And then we need to do something to stop the equipment and the devices from looking for electricity when there is none. If there are too many devices looking for electricity when there's just none in the wires to be had, you can have a substantial power failure that might take a long time to get fixed. So the main ways the utilities deal with that extreme case when it comes along is to start turning people off, and they'll turn off circuits. In Texas, they had rolling blackouts, as they call it, where they turned off circuits a few at a time to make sure that the scarce power they had left was available and balanced with the number of households that were asking for it.
So it is the top of the hour over here. So I am going to turn it over to Anna in just a minute, and we're going to do some breakout rooms. So what's going to happen now is there might be some people who have to head out. So I am going to just quickly do my last slide now, even though it's not the end of the session. We can have breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back in so that Harvey can answer some more questions. But in case you do have to peel off, I want to invite everybody to complete a 1-minute survey. We want to hear your thoughts about this event and what ideas you might have about future events. And if anyone you know missed this event, we're going to be releasing the recording of this on YouTube, but then also through our podcast, where you can listen to it as well as previous events. And so you can subscribe to the podcast. It's just called Civic Series, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. We also have our next event planned. We have a political psychologist who's going to be joining us and talking about how you form your political identity and what it means about democracy and how it's shaping democracy. So why you're liberal, why you're conservative, and how you make some of those value judgments and issue stances. And you can register for that event, still free, at civicseries.org. Okay, great. So Anna, let me turn it back over to you.
All right. So we'll be going into breakout rooms. I'm going to put a few questions up in the chat. And also the ones are on the screen here. You know, what's one thing you learned? What's one question you still have? And did anything change for you about your understanding of the electric grid? So I'm gonna, create some breakout rooms. It will be assigned automatically, and then we'll do that for about 7 to 10 minutes, and I will bring you back. So enjoy the discussions.
Interesting talk.
And initial thoughts on the breakout rooms? Good stuff, medium. All right, great. All right, Laura, is there anything else we need to touch on before we move into probably 15 more minutes of Q&A?
No, we had some really great questions, and I strongly encourage people in my room to ask them. So I hope that they do.
All right. So Jeffrey had a question before we went to the breakout room. So I'm going to ask him to unmute himself so he can ask his question.
Actually, at the beginning, you talked, Michael, about the way we got to our actual electric grid. And I was wondering, since we're trying to electrify everything like the cars and every means of transportation, I was wondering if our electric grid will, is gonna know a new revolution, or if it is already is able to assume a new enormous production for if tomorrow every cars get electric.
I'm not sure I completely captured your question. It sounded like you're asking whether the electric grid is going to expand a lot to cover other needs.
Yeah, I heard, electric vehicles. So as electric vehicles come online, can the grid support that?
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. I think that deals with essentially that issue. What's fortunate is that if we're smart about it, we don't need to draw the electricity off the grid at the times when it's really congested and at peak. Even in the old days, before we had solar and wind energy going up and down, with the power systems that we had before, the amount of power that we drew on average, sort of the most typical hours of the year, was only about half the amount that we needed on the peak hours. So that means at any point in time, we have twice as much potential electricity available as we're actually using, except for those peak days. So to the extent that we can be smart about it, we can put a lot more electricity on the grid and not run out of capacity. And nothing is easier to do that with than an electric vehicle, because on average, an electric vehicle is driven 2 hours a day. So you got 22 other hours of the day to choose from for when you charge it up. And probably you only need 4 or 5 hours. So if that time at 6 to 8 o'clock at night is not a good time, then that's not the time to charge your electric vehicle. Later is, or another time. What's interesting is because people don't have the smart systems built in yet, a lot of people come home from driving their electric vehicle all day and plug it in at 6 o'clock at night and fill up the battery with electricity at exactly the wrong time. So that's the problem we need to fix.
Yeah, I appreciate that is a conversation not just about quantity, but time.
Exactly.
Which is a very different question and a very different solution to that problem.
Yeah, Laura mentioned before that there was some great discussion in her breakout room. So if you had questions from that, definitely don't be shy. You can either raise your hand or just let me know, and then you can ask that question. But let me go with one question here. Oh, here's a question. Mary Beth, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. My question is there a smart feature to the Tesla?
Yes, every electric vehicle, not only Tesla, but every single one that's made, has some way to deal with this question that electricity is cheaper sometimes than it is at other times. For example, almost I think all of them have an internet connection between their car and an app that the car company has made for it. They all have a way that you can program it. I have a plug-in hybrid Ford Fusion, and I can put in something called a go time, which says I'm going to go, I want my car ready to go at 7 a.m. in the morning. And, Ford Fusion, you can decide between now and 7 a.m. when to charge up the car, as long as it's full at 7 a.m. That's built in, but I live in a place where the electric company doesn't charge me a different price at different times of the day. So it doesn't really make any difference, even though the electric company itself is exposed to hugely different prices at different times of the day. So when I do the wrong thing and charge up my electric vehicle at 6 o'clock at night, or don't, have any way of responding to what electricity really costs, I'm making bad decisions that drive up the average price of electricity for everybody. So hopefully we'll fix that. Hopefully we'll get to the point where I have an electric water heater. The electric water heater should know better than to turn on at the wrong times. It should charge up at the right times. But it doesn't have the price signal to do that yet. So hopefully we'll fix that.
Thanks for your question, Mary Beth. Anne, go ahead, ask your question.
I think he just answered it. I don't know. I was wondering if it might be possible to design smart plug-in devices with embedded batteries so that they are designed to pull and store power when rates are cheapest, and then, use it without boosting up usage during peak times. It sounds like that's what you were just saying.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of places now. I mean, certainly it's not, when I said half the country, I don't know exactly if it's half or not, but I know, for example, in the Phoenix area, they have very different prices at different times of the day. And California has prices that vary a lot at different times of the day. And the market is learning how to create value for customers with that. So the devices, the water heater, washing machine, are all being built now with ways that they can be you just put in a setting and it'll automatically run when electricity is cheaper and not do it when it's the most expensive. And you gonna follow up?
Yeah, she has a.
Yeah, sorry. That's a little different than what I was talking about. I was wondering whether the device could just recharge itself, stay plugged in, but have a battery that just recharges itself on a schedule when rates are lowest, or when there's, so that it can modulate itself rather than running overnight. It would run during the daytime when I need it, but off of stored power that it got when rates were low.
Like a computer that the power cable can choose when to charge the computer.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I don't really think I haven't seen much of that, but it makes sense, particularly with the fact that batteries are so much cheaper now. I challenge my students to come up with things that would work or potentially work, and to try to pencil them out and see if it makes sense. And that may make sense. I think for a lot of devices, the idea of having some way to store power and then use it later with a battery might be a great idea.
All right, Kieran, you're back up again with another question. Go for it.
Hi again. My kind of like a big question of the past little while for me has been how much grid backup is kind of needed to transition fully to renewable. I know I've seen like some estimates that we'll need like 2 days backup or 7 days backup, and we need batteries and pumped storage and all sorts of other hydrogen storage to do it. Is there any kind of consensus of what we're looking at going forward?
I don't know the answer in terms of days of backup. I mean, there clearly it's a big part of designing the grid, and one of the advantages of a 90% carbon-free grid rather than a 100% carbon-free grid is that it's 5 times easier if you have a little bit that you do the old way. So there are people doing it. It's like the old 80-20 rule or something like that. Most of it is easy, but that last mile is really hard. So. that's that's certainly a challenge. But the thing that seems to be the theme is an orchestration that essentially, if you have grid interactive buildings that are able to change how they use electricity in response to the circumstances of the grid, as well as having grid flexibility by having all the storage it can have, either from batteries or pump storage, then you can get pretty much all the way there. But yeah, being able to use that cheap surplus electricity to make something like hydrogen to handle the times when you have several days when you have to, you don't have any sun or any wind, you just got to use, and it's really cold and you need a lot of electricity. That's probably the right answer, but the hydrogen technology isn't here yet.
Right. Thanks.
All right. Great question, Karen. We have time for maybe one more live question. So if you have it, this is your last chance. So one question from the Eventbrite. Some people asked some questions about microgrids. The questions were a little bit specific, but I don't know what microgrids are. If you can maybe give a brief explainer, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, the idea I was trying to show in that picture before, we didn't talk about it too much, but you to think about yourself as a consumer, right? You consume this, you consume that, you're buying this, right? They call a lot of people now prosumers. They're producing electricity as well as consuming electricity. So they're prosumers. So now you have individual buildings or sometimes groups of buildings. They're a combination of having their own distributed generation as well as buying power from the grid. And those groups of buildings are called microgrids. So the MIT campus is kind of a microgrid. It has its own power generation as well as being a consumer. And so it does a lot of it itself, but it also buys a lot of electricity from Eversource, the local utility. It's a combination of those things. It's not a freestanding microgrid. In a island somewhere, you might have a microgrid that stands by itself. There are people who have homes with a big generator, and they're their own microgrid. So there's some variety in how the term is used. And one of the things that one of my students is working on is in off-grid areas in India and Africa, essentially giving a power system in something the size of a suitcase, where there's a fold-out solar collector and a battery and a place to plug in your cell phone and 4 LED bulbs and a little more power for other things. So you sort of your instant microgrid.
Yeah, very cool. Our last question, Kelly, you get the last one. And let me ask you to unmute, that would be helpful.
Hello. Mine's like super basic question, but I was born in the 80s, and so electricity was always here. So it just shows up automatically, which is great. So we oftentimes take, I take it for granted. So I'm curious, and I didn't realize that, the amount of electricity varied, depending on demand. So when I'm not using the lights, where is that energy either stored or, because as soon as I turn on the switch, it's there. So
yeah, well, just using the law of large numbers, that yours is going, your lights are going on and off, and other people's are going on and off. And they basically buy power from power plants, so that there's just about the amount of power going into the wires to equal the amount that you're using and everyone else is using at that moment in time. So it's a little bit tricky, and yeah, some of it does get dumped into the ground, but they have a combination of plants that are on all the time and plants that they turn on as needed, so that they have approximately the right amount of power going into the wires to cover what you need.
And I'm assuming it's all controlled by computers, very smart computers.
And you know, that you've said since the 1980s, you've always had it. And that's certainly the case, and certainly it's been the case for my whole life. But just as recently ago as the 1930s, a lot of the United States did not have electricity. It was a project that was done with stimulus funding during the Great Depression to basically power rural America. And most of it did not have power to that point.
That might be a good chance to close out, because that is what we're facing in the US right now. And that's what President Biden is proposing to do. Another large government effort to change what our energy system looks like. So thank you all for joining. Just a reminder to fill out our 1-minute survey and register for our next event about how you formed your political identity and what it means for democracy. I think that you all agree that it's very obvious that Harvey has a lot of experience teaching. Harvey, you did a fabulous job at breaking down something that is incredibly complicated into things that we can all understand, very simple, accessible language. So thank you so much for your time tonight. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sorry I didn't have the lights right the whole time in the room, but otherwise, it
illustrated the point.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.